History is often described as a continuous story, moving steadily from one moment to the next. Dates align, civilizations rise and fall, and timelines appear complete. Yet when the evidence is examined closely, that sense of continuity begins to weaken. Large portions of human time survive unevenly. Some eras are dense with records, buildings, and names. Others exist only as thin traces, separated by long stretches where the record grows quiet. This documentary does not search for forgotten legends or hidden truths. It examines how history is shaped by what survives and what does not. Soil erodes. Cities rebuild over themselves. Writing systems disappear. Memory selects what is repeated and leaves the rest behind. Across archaeology, texts, and environmental archives, the past often resumes after gaps that feel like beginnings rather than continuations. These gaps are not empty, but they are difficult to see. This series follows those spaces carefully, without filling them in. The record breaks, then begins again. In museums and archives, the first thing that stands out is how uneven the surviving record is. The past is not kept as a continuous strip of time. It arrives in fragments, set apart by long intervals where fewer traces remain. Many of those intervals were created by ordinary processes. Wind erodes exposed layers. Rivers shift their channels and remove sediment. Shorelines move as sea levels rise and fall. Stone and clay break down unless they are sealed away. Archaeologists work inside this unevenness. A site can preserve a hearth, a few broken tools, and a scatter of animal bone, while the next several thousand years in the same region leave almost nothing that can be recovered. In many places, later building activity clears earlier levels. Walls are dismantled for stone. Floors are cut through to reach new foundations. The result is a record with gaps that are structural rather than dramatic. It is missing time because time is difficult to keep. Even where layers exist, they do not always speak clearly. Radiocarbon dating, developed after the late 1940s through the work of Willard Libby and others, measures the decay of carbon-14 in once living material. The measurement produces a range. Calibration curves adjust for past variations in atmospheric carbon, and those curves carry their own uncertainty. In practice, a date can be narrow in one period and broader in another. Not because the past changed, but because the reference data does. Written records appear late and unevenly as well. Some societies used perishable materials. Others wrote on stone, clay, and metal that survived better. Even then, writing often served limited purposes. Administrative tablets track grain, labour, and livestock. Monumental inscriptions present royal events and building projects. Personal letters survive in certain places because the climate and storage conditions allowed them to remain intact. Most daily speech, most names, and most routine actions do not reach the present. This is one reason the deep past often feels like it begins again and again. A region can show intense activity in one period, followed by less visible occupation, followed by a new rise in evidence. In the Levant, traces of late Ice Age and early Holocene communities appear in sites associated with the Natufian period, then change into early farming settlements in the 10th and 9th millennia BCE. At Jericho, layers include early walls and towers that were built, used, and later buried. While the details of the people who planned them remain sparse, the material is present, but the inner structure of life is largely inferred. A similar pattern appears at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia, where monumental stone enclosures were built and used in the 10th millennium BCE, then deliberately filled in. The carved pillars survived because they were buried. The society that made them did not leave an archive in the later sense. The site gives a strong physical signal, while surrounding decades and centuries remain less clear. Evidence that survives can be unusually sharp, and the adjacent time can be quiet. In Mesopotamia, the shift from prehistory into history is often described through changes in settlement, agriculture, and writing. Here too, the record has breaks. One layer in a tel can be full of painted pottery and domestic debris, followed by a level that looks thinner, then another that contains administrative tablets. The continuity of human occupation may be real, but the continuity of preserved detail is not guaranteed. Some of the most visible boundaries are boundaries in survival. One artifact shows how writing can compress time into an ordered surface. The object is known as the Weld Blundell prism, an old Babylonian clay prism now kept at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It is a four-sided text, written in Sumerian, listing rulers and their reigns. The prism was acquired in the early 20th century through the collector Herbert Weld Blundell, and its text belongs to a group of versions commonly called the Sumerian King List. The wording differs across manuscripts, but the structure is consistent. Kingship is presented as something that descended from heaven, then moved from city to city. The list is administrative in tone, even when the numbers are not. Early sections name rulers with reigns measured in units that translate into lengths far beyond ordinary lifespans. Later sections move towards shorter, more familiar reign lengths, and toward dynasties that can be placed alongside other Mesopotamian sources. Between these sections, the text marks a dividing event with a simple line. In many versions, it states that a flood swept over, and that kingship was lowered again afterward. The inscription does not dwell on the flood. It functions as a boundary marker, separating one order of time from another. Clay tablets and prisms like this one are often treated with care by modern scholars because they blend different kinds of information. They include city names that map to real places such as Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. They also contain royal names that appear in other texts, while some do not. The King List is not a diary and not a modern history. It is a structured statement about legitimacy and succession. Its value, for a careful reader, is partly in what it shows about how the past was organized in the minds of scribes. Other Mesopotamian sources describe floods in ways that can be compared without forcing them into a single account. A Sumerian composition, often called the Eridu Genesis, includes a flood narrative in fragmentary form. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in later versions, includes the flood story told by Utnapishtim, with details about a boat, animals, and survival. These texts were copied and recopied, and they reflect literary traditions as well as memory. They do not function like field reports, but they do show that a flood boundary was a stable idea within Mesopotamian writing. Outside Mesopotamia, flood layers in archaeology appear in specific contexts and do not align into one universal event. At certain sites along rivers, thick, alluvial deposits show episodes of flooding that buried buildings and changed settlement patterns. In the southern Iraq region, the dynamics of the Tigris and Euphrates created repeated flood and silt cycles over long periods. These events can be local, severe, and historically important, while still being part of a normal river system. The record can hold many floods without implying one single reset. The larger point is quieter. The past can be divided in two ways at once. It can be divided by events that people remembered and wrote about. It can also be divided by whether material survived, whether it was later destroyed, and whether it was found. The King List places a flood line between a section of extreme reign lengths and a section that resembles conventional dynastic history. Archaeology places its own lines where layers thin out or disappear. Both kinds of boundaries shape what later readers think they are seeing. When modern researchers describe gaps in human history, they often mean different things. Sometimes the gap is a true absence of evidence. Sometimes it is an absence of excavation. Sometimes it is evidence that exists, but has not been securely dated or widely published. In other cases, a gap is created by classification. A period can be called prehistory because it lacks writing in that region, even though it was fully lived and full of social structure. That label can make earlier time seem empty when it is only undocumented in a particular way. Across the world, time does not enter archives evenly. Egypt keeps certain dynasties in stone and papyrus, while other periods survive through scattered inscriptions and later summaries. Early China has oracle bone texts that preserve names and rituals, while earlier cultures are known mainly through material remains. In Europe, many prehistoric societies left no writing that survived, so their changes appear through pottery styles, burial practices, and the movement of metalwork. Each region has its own rhythm of preservation. A documentary about lost millennia begins with this unevenness rather than with an answer. The question of what is missing is tied to how the record is made and how it is kept. The first task is to notice the breaks without treating them as a single kind of break. Some are created by nature, some are created by human rebuilding, Some are created by writing practices and by what people chose to record. The result is a timeline that can look like a clean sequence on paper, while being patched together from separated pieces in the ground. Beneath the floors of the first cities, in many early cities, the ground itself became an archive. Buildings were not cleared away completely when they fell into disuse. Walls collapsed, roofs decayed, and surfaces settled. New structures were then raised on top of what remained. Over time, this process produced mounded landscapes that contained long sequences of occupation stacked vertically. These mounds, known in the Near East as tels, are among the most common archaeological features in regions with early urban development. At sites such as Uruk, Nippur, and Lagash, excavation has revealed layers that represent centuries of rebuilding. A single trench can cut through domestic floors, workshop debris, and administrative spaces belonging to different periods, separated by thin bands of soil or ash. Each layer marks a moment when a structure was abandoned, altered, or replaced. The people who rebuilt were often the descendants of those who lived there before, yet their actions reduced the visibility of earlier phases. This pattern is especially clear in southern Mesopotamia, where mud brick was the primary building material. Sun-dried brick erodes easily when exposed, but when buried, it can preserve wall outlines and floor plans. When a building deteriorated, its bricks were sometimes reused, but often they were left in place and leveled. A new floor would be laid directly above the old one. Over generations, the living surface rose, while earlier rooms sank into obscurity. At Uruk, one of the largest early cities, excavations conducted by German teams in the early 20th century documented deep occupational sequences. In the Iana district, layers associated with monumental buildings from the late 4th millennium BCE were found resting atop earlier domestic levels. Beneath those were even earlier phases, with simpler architecture and fewer administrative objects. The deeper layers are harder to reach and are often less completely explored, not because they are less important, but because access becomes more difficult and destructive. The same process occurred in smaller settlements. At Tel Brak in modern northeastern Syria, long sequences of habitation show gradual growth rather than sudden appearance. Excavated levels reveal changes in house size, street layout, and craft production over time. Yet, between well-defined phases, there are intervals that appear thinner, with fewer objects and less clear structure. These thinner layers may represent periods of reduced activity, changes in building practice, or simply less durable construction. Archaeologists must decide where one phase ends and another begins. These decisions are based on changes in pottery styles, architectural layout, and material assemblages. A floor with one type of ceramic may be assigned to a different phase than a floor with another. This method is practical, but it compresses time into categories. A gradual transition can appear as a boundary line in a publication drawing. The lived experience of change is flattened into layers. In some cases, earlier levels were intentionally sealed. At certain sites, large construction projects required leveling uneven ground. This could involve filling older structures with earth, rubble, and debris. The act of sealing protected what lay beneath, but it also erased it from view. Later inhabitants walked across surfaces that concealed generations of earlier occupation without any visible sign. One example comes from early temple platforms. At Eridu, a site near the ancient coastline of the Persian Gulf, successive temple buildings were constructed on the same spot over many centuries. Each new structure was built atop the remains of the previous one. Excavations revealed a sequence of superimposed shrines, each slightly larger or differently oriented. The earliest levels show modest reed and mud structures, while later levels are more substantial. Between them are fill layers that contain little information beyond the fact of rebuilding. These accumulations can span long periods. A few meters of deposit can represent thousands of years. To a modern observer, this vertical compression can make time feel abbreviated. A change that unfolded slowly across many generations may appear as a sudden shift when viewed in cross-section. The deeper the excavation goes, the fewer details are usually preserved, not because life was simpler, but because fewer objects survive and fewer surfaces remain intact. Urban maintenance also contributed to loss of detail. Streets were resurfaced, drainage channels were recut, Walls were repaired and thickened. Each intervention altered the earlier layout. Written records, where they exist, rarely describe these routine actions. Administrative tablets record deliveries and labor assignments, but they do not describe how a house was remodeled or how a courtyard changed shape over decades. In some cities, abandonment followed by reoccupation further complicates the record. A settlement might be partially deserted due to environmental stress, political change, or shifting trade routes. Later, people returned and rebuilt in different ways. The gap between occupations may be archaeologically thin, even if it lasted centuries. Wind-blown dust and minor erosion can leave little trace of absence. The city of Mari, located along the Euphrates, illustrates another aspect of this problem. Excavations uncovered a large palace complex from the early 2nd millennium BCE, with thousands of administrative texts preserved because they were baked by fire when the building was destroyed. Beneath this palace were earlier levels with different layouts and fewer texts. The dramatic preservation of one moment contrasts with the relative silence of earlier periods, even though those periods were no less active. The uneven survival of records creates a distorted emphasis. Periods marked by destruction, fire, or sealing often leave more material than periods of stability. A city that burned once can be better documented than one that quietly evolved. This pattern repeats across regions. Catastrophic events can sharpen the archaeological signal, while long continuity can blur it. Outside Mesopotamia, similar processes shaped early urban sites. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa show extensive rebuilding with brick platforms and raised streets. Earlier phases exist beneath later ones, but groundwater and later disturbance have made them difficult to access. As a result, the early development of these cities is less clearly documented than their mature phases. In Egypt, temple complexes along the Nile were often rebuilt on the same sacred ground. At sites such as Karnak, layers of construction span from the Middle Kingdom through the Roman period. Earlier structures were dismantled or incorporated into later walls. Stone blocks were reused, sometimes with earlier inscriptions turned inward. The physical record preserves continuity of place, while obscuring the full sequence of use. What lies beneath the floors of the first cities is not a single hidden chapter, but many partial ones. Some are represented by foundations and post holes, some by scattered refuse pits, some by nothing more than soil color changes. Each piece contributes to a sense of depth without providing a complete narrative. The gaps are not always empty. They are often filled with material that resists clear interpretation. As excavation techniques improved over the 20th century, archaeologists became more cautious about removing deep layers. Stratigraphic recording aimed to document every change, but practical limits remain. A site can only be excavated once. Decisions about where to dig determine which parts of the record are preserved for future study and which are removed. The accumulation beneath ancient floors shows how history can be lost without being destroyed. It can be covered, leveled, and walked over. Time becomes compacted, and long sequences are reduced to thin bands of earth. The deeper the layer, the quieter its voice tends to be, even though it once supported full lives, routines, and social structures that no longer have visible outlines. When time is missing from the ground, in some landscapes, the archaeological record does not form a stack of layers at all. Instead, it thins, breaks, or disappears. Entire spans of occupation can be absent, leaving no clear surface to excavate and no structures to map. These absences are not always the result of abandonment. They are often the outcome of erosion, later disturbance, or environmental change that removed earlier deposits before they could be sealed. River valleys provide many examples. Along active floodplains, sediment is constantly reworked. Channels migrate laterally, cutting into older deposits and redepositing material downstream. A settlement established near a river may be occupied for centuries, yet later floods can scour away its remains. What survives may be limited to deeper features, such as pits or wells, while floors and walls are erased. The record that reaches the present can suggest a short occupation, even when the site was long-lived. The lower courses of the Tigris and Euphrates illustrate this process. Over the Holocene, both rivers shifted repeatedly across their plains. Studies of alluvial cores show alternating phases of deposition and erosion. In some areas, early settlements were buried under meters of silt. In others, earlier layers were cut away. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 20th century noted large gaps between known sites, gaps that later geomorphological research suggested were created by river action rather than by human absence. Wind erosion can have similar effects in arid regions. In deserts and semi-arid zones, exposed surfaces are gradually deflated as fine particles are removed. What remains can be a lag surface of stones and durable objects. This process can strip away shallow occupation layers entirely. At some prehistoric sites in North Africa and Arabia, stone tools remain scattered across the surface with little associated sediment. The tools indicate repeated human presence, but the soil that once held hearths, shelters, and organic material has been lost. Coastal areas show another pattern of loss. As sea levels rose after the last ice age, shorelines moved inland. Settlements that once stood near the coast were submerged or eroded. Underwater archaeology has identified submerged landscapes in the North Sea, the Mediterranean, and off the coasts of Southeast Asia. These areas were inhabited when sea levels were lower, but much of the evidence now lies underwater, dispersed or buried beneath marine sediments. What is missing on land may exist elsewhere, but it is harder to reach and less completely known. Later human activity can remove earlier traces just as effectively. Large-scale agriculture, especially deep ploughing, disrupts shallow archaeological deposits. In many parts of Europe, Roman and prehistoric layers have been truncated by centuries of farming. Features that once lay just below the surface are mixed or destroyed. What remains are isolated artifacts without clear context. The absence of stratified deposits can make long periods appear archaeologically silent. Urban expansion has a similar effect. Modern construction often involves leveling ground, digging foundations, and installing utilities. In the process, earlier layers are removed. Rescue excavations sometimes document what is uncovered, but these interventions are brief and selective. Many sites are recorded only partially. Entire neighborhoods of earlier cities can vanish beneath modern ones without full documentation. Some regions show apparent gaps that reflect research history rather than past reality. Areas that have been less studied can appear empty on distribution maps. When surveys expand or methods improve, those gaps often fill in. For example, systematic field surveys in parts of Greece during the late 20th century identified numerous small rural sites from periods previously thought to be sparsely populated. The land had always been used, but the evidence was subtle and had not been recorded. Dating uncertainty can also create the impression of missing time. When material cannot be securely dated, it may be assigned broadly or left unassigned. A site might be known to have been occupied sometime within a span of several millennia. In such cases, the occupation does not anchor neatly to established chronologies. The period appears thin not because it lacked activity, but because it lacks precision. Caves and rock shelters offer a contrasting example. These environments can preserve long sequences because they are protected from erosion. Yet even here, gaps occur. Sediment accumulation can stop for long periods, or earlier deposits can be removed by water flow or human cleaning. At sites such as Kebara Cave in Israel or Blombos Cave in South Africa, stratigraphic sequences show both dense occupation layers and intervals with little deposition. The absence of sediment does not necessarily mean absence of people. It can mean that conditions did not favour preservation. In open-air sites, preservation depends heavily on rapid burial. A camp that was used briefly and then left exposed may leave almost no trace. Repeated short-term occupations can blend into a diffuse scatter. Without clear stratigraphy, separating episodes becomes difficult. The ground records use unevenly, and time can collapse into a single surface. Large-scale climatic shifts have also affected what survives. During periods of increased aridity, vegetation cover decreases, exposing soils to erosion. During wetter phases, sedimentation can increase, burying earlier surfaces. These processes do not align neatly with cultural periods. A climatic phase can remove evidence from one region while preserving it in another. The resulting archaeological map is patchy. One well-documented case involves the so-called dark earth, layers found in parts of Europe. In cities like Rome and London, deposits from the late Roman and early medieval periods are characterized by dark organic rich soils. These layers often lack clear architectural remains and were once interpreted as evidence of urban decline. Later analysis showed that they formed through different land use practices, including gardening and waste disposal. The apparent gap in monumental building did not equal a gap in occupation. In other contexts, the absence is more complete. Entire cultural phases known from one region may be invisible in another due to preservation bias. For example, early pastoralist groups who relied on mobile herding left lighter material signatures than sedentary farmers. Their camps may not survive well, especially in environments subject to erosion. When such groups move through a landscape, their presence can be archaeologically faint, leading to underrepresentation in historical reconstructions. These missing layers influence how time is divided. Periodization schemes often rely on visible changes in material culture. When evidence is sparse, periods can be shortened or merged. A long span with little surviving material may be labelled as a transition or an interval. This labelling reflects the state of the record rather than the density of human activity. The idea of hiatus appears frequently in archaeological literature. It denotes a break in deposition or occupation, but its meaning varies. A hiatus can last decades or millennia. It can be local or widespread. In many cases, it marks a lack of evidence rather than a confirmed absence of people. The word functions as a placeholder for uncertainty. Understanding where time is missing from the ground requires attention to formation processes. Archaeology does not recover the past directly. It recovers what remains after natural and human forces have acted on it. Every site is shaped by these forces in specific ways. The missing portions are part of that history, even though they are harder to describe. The quiet gaps in the ground are not uniform voids. They differ by environment, by later use, and by research intensity. Some can be narrowed as new methods develop, such as remote sensing, soil analysis, and underwater survey. Others may remain unresolved. The absence itself becomes a fact to be accounted for, shaping how the deep past is outlined. Names without faces in the first chronicles. The earliest written records do not introduce people as individuals in the modern sense. They register names, titles, quantities, and actions that mattered to administration. The surface of a tablet preserves ink or impressions, but not expression, tone, or context beyond what was required. Writing begins as a tool for ordering resources, not for describing lives. As a result, the first chronicles are populated by names without faces. In Mesopotamia, the earliest known writing appears in the late 4th millennium BCE, at sites such as Uruk. These texts are largely administrative. They record deliveries of barley, counts of sheep and goats, and allocations of labour. A sign can stand for a person, but the person remains undefined. A worker may be identified only by a name and a role, with no indication of age, family, or personal history. The record is precise and narrow at the same time. Personal names appear frequently, but unevenly. Some individuals are named repeatedly across multiple tablets, suggesting long-term involvement in an institution. The documents do not explain why. A scribe records what needs to be tracked and omits the rest. The result is a partial population, shaped by bureaucratic relevance rather than by social proportion. Royal inscriptions present a different form of compression. In early dynastic Mesopotamia, rulers commissioned texts that listed building projects, dedications to gods, and military actions. These inscriptions name kings, cities, and deities. They sometimes include short statements of lineage. The king is visible as a figure of authority, but the people who built the walls or farmed the fields are largely absent. The text moves from name to name without stopping. The Sumerian king list, copied in various forms from the early 2nd millennium BCE onward, demonstrates how writing can impose order across long spans of time. The list arranges rulers into sequences associated with cities, assigning each a reign length. The format creates continuity even where other sources are silent. Names are preserved, but details are not. A ruler can be said to have reigned for decades without any surviving description of how that reign was experienced. In Egypt, early historical writing shows similar patterns. Royal annals and inscriptions carved on stone walls record events such as temple construction, offerings to gods, and victories over named enemies. The Palermo stone, a fragmentary basalt slab dated to the Old Kingdom, lists kings and notable events year by year. It records Nile flood levels and ceremonial acts. It does not record daily administration or the lives of ordinary people. The chronology is structured, but the social field is narrow. Papyrus documents from later periods expand the range of recorded activity, but they still privilege certain roles. Tax records, legal contracts, and letters preserve names tied to transactions. A land sale names buyer and seller. A will names heirs. These documents offer glimpses of family relationships, but only where they intersect with property or obligation. People who did not leave such records remain largely invisible. In early China, oracle bone inscriptions from the late Shang period, around the 13th century BCE, provide another example of names without faces. The inscriptions record divinations conducted on behalf of the king. They name ancestors, officials, and places. The questions concern harvests, warfare, and ritual timing. The individuals named are nodes in a ritual and political network. Their personal lives are not described. The writing captures decision-making at the top, not the structure beneath it. Chronicles and annals often aim to stabilize memory. By fixing names and sequences, they reduce uncertainty. This function can obscure variability. When a king's reign is given a single number of years, the internal changes within that reign disappear. Periods of stability and disruption are flattened into duration. The text becomes a timeline rather than a narrative. This flattening is visible in later compilations as well. In Mesopotamia, the Assyrian king list and eponym chronicles list rulers and officials year by year. These texts were used to date events and maintain administrative order. They are valuable because they align with dated inscriptions and archaeological layers. At the same time, they present a view of history centered on offices rather than on communities. The act of copying also shapes what survives. Scribes reproduced texts that were useful or authoritative. Lists and chronicles fit this category. Personal accounts and local records were less likely to be recopied over centuries. As tablets broke or were discarded, only some genres were replenished. The survival of names is therefore selective. It reflects scribal priorities as much as past realities. In some cases, later historians attempted to expand earlier records. Classical authors writing about Egypt and Mesopotamia, such as Manetho and Berossus, compiled king lists and narratives based on temple archives and local traditions. Their works survive only in fragments and quotations. They preserve sequences of rulers and dynasties, sometimes with additional commentary. Even so, their focus remains on succession and duration. The social landscape remains indistinct. The problem is not a lack of intelligence or interest on the part of ancient writers. It is a function of what writing was used for. Early writing systems were costly to maintain. Materials, training, and institutional support were required. Writing was applied where it produced clear value, such as taxation, ritual coordination, and royal display. Recording the lives of most people did not serve these functions. Archaeology sometimes fills in what texts omit, but the two records do not always align. A name may appear in an inscription without a corresponding material signature. A neighborhood may be excavated without any surviving names attached to it. When both are present, the connection can be indirect. A seal impression bearing a name may be found in a building, but the relationship between the named individual and the space remains uncertain. This disjunction affects how early history is read. Texts suggest continuity through lists and sequences. The ground reveals change through shifting layouts and material practices. Names persist across copies, while buildings rise and fall. The written record can make a period seem stable, even when the archaeological record shows gradual transformation. There are exceptions that highlight the rule. In certain contexts, such as personal letters preserved in dry climates, individual voices emerge more clearly. The old Assyrian trade archives from Kanesh in Anatolia, dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE, include letters exchanged between merchants and their families. These texts mention concerns about shipments, debts, and household matters. Names here are linked to daily decisions. Even so, the archive represents a specific group engaged in long-distance trade, not the population as a whole. Over time, historical writing expanded in scope, but the early pattern remained influential. Chronological frameworks built from king lists and annals became the backbone of regional histories. Later interpretations often rely on these frameworks, even as they acknowledge their limits. The presence of a name anchors a period. The absence of detail leaves much unspoken. Names without faces are not errors in the record. They are the record as it was produced. Writing preserved what it was designed to preserve. The gaps that remain are shaped by function, material survival, and copying practices. The result is a past populated by identified figures whose lives are known only in outline, and by countless others who are known only through indirect traces or not at all, calendars, regnal years, and the weight of counting. Time enters the historical record not as a continuous flow, but as a sequence of counted units. Early societies marked time in ways that supported administration, ritual, and seasonal coordination. These systems were practical before they were descriptive. They did not aim to capture experience, only to keep activities aligned. The result is a record where time is measured carefully, but unevenly represented. In southern Mesopotamia, early calendars were tied to agricultural cycles. Months were named for seasonal tasks, such as harvesting or ploughing. The length of the year was adjusted through observation, with intercalary months added when necessary to realign lunar months with the solar year. These adjustments were made locally and could differ from city to city. A date recorded in one archive might not align perfectly with a date from another region, even if they referred to the same span of days. Administrative texts often identify years not by numbers, but by events. In the 3rd millennium BCE, it was common to name a year after a notable occurrence, such as the construction of a temple, the defeat of an enemy, or the dedication of a statue. A tablet might be dated to the year the canal of Ningirzu was dug, or the year the king brought the statue of a god to the city. These year names were meaningful within a specific political context. Once that context faded, the date became harder to place without additional reference lists. To manage this complexity, scribes compiled year name lists. These documents aligned regnal years with their corresponding events. The lists allowed officials to translate a named year into a sequence relative to a ruler's reign. The system worked as long as the lists were maintained and copied accurately. When reigns overlapped, or when rival dynasties claimed authority at the same time, the alignment became less stable. Regnal dating itself introduced another layer of compression. Years were counted from the accession of a ruler. Year 1 marked the first full year after accession, not the beginning of an era in a broader sense. When a king died and another took the throne, the count reset. Long-term continuity depended on later historians linking reigns together. Without such linkage, time breaks into segments defined by political change rather than by chronological flow. In Egypt, regnal years functioned in a similar way. Inscriptions and papyri refer to events occurring in specific years of a pharaoh's reign. A quarry inscription might state that stone was extracted in year 19 of King Senusret. The date is precise within that reign, but it does not situate the event absolutely without a broader framework. Later, king lists and chronologies were required to connect individual reigns into a longer sequence. Egyptian calendars were more standardized than many others, with a civil year of 365 days divided into 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 epigomenal days. This calendar did not account for the extra fraction of a day in the solar year, so it drifted slowly over centuries. Festivals tied to seasons gradually shifted relative to the agricultural cycle. The calendar remained stable in form, but its relationship to the natural year changed. Dates remained consistent on paper, while their seasonal meaning shifted. In early China, timekeeping combined lunar months with solar observation. Calendars were adjusted through intercalation to maintain alignment with seasons. The authority to regulate the calendar was tied to political legitimacy. A new dynasty might issue a revised calendar to signal the restoration of order. Official histories record these changes, noting when months were added or realigned. The act of correction was itself an assertion of control over time. Chronicles structured around regnal years and calendars create a particular view of the past. Events appear as points within an ordered grid. What falls outside that grid is harder to place. Daily routines, gradual shifts in practice, and informal arrangements rarely receive dated mention. When they do, The date often marks a transaction or decree rather than the practice itself. Counting also shapes how duration is perceived. A reign listed as lasting 30 years appears uniform, even if those years included periods of conflict, recovery, or decline. Administrative continuity can mask social variability. The calendar advances steadily, regardless of conditions on the ground. In the written record, a year of famine and a year of abundance may occupy the same amount of space. Astronomical observations sometimes provide fixed points within these systems. Eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and heliacal risings were recorded in some cultures because they had ritual or predictive significance. Modern scholars use these observations to anchor chronologies. For example, Assyrian records, noting solar eclipses, have been correlated with astronomical calculations to establish absolute dates. These anchors are valuable, but they are rare. Large spans of time remain dated only relative to reigns and lists. The reliance on counting can also produce apparent precision where none exists. A tablet dated to a specific day and month may give the impression of exactness, yet the underlying calendar may have been adjusted differently in another city. Scribal errors, delayed copying, and regional variation all affect accuracy. The date is exact within its system, but the system itself is not fixed across space. Later historians attempted to reconcile these systems. In the Hellenistic period, scholars such as Eratosthenes and later chronographers compared king lists, regnal years, and astronomical data to construct unified timelines. Their efforts involved selection and interpretation. Conflicting data were smoothed or harmonized. Gaps were bridged through assumption. The resulting chronologies became influential, even when their foundations were uneven. The use of eras eventually reduced some of this fragmentation. Systems that counted years from a fixed starting point, such as the Seleucid era beginning in 312 BCE, allowed events to be dated without reference to individual reigns. Even so, earlier periods remained organized primarily through regnal frameworks. The deeper the past, the more time is divided by rulers rather than by continuous count. Calendars and regnal years give structure to history, but they also limit what can be seen. They prioritize official actions and formal events. They render time legible to administration while leaving much of lived experience undated. The weight of counting presses history into columns and sequences, making it orderly and narrow at once. When modern readers encounter early chronologies, they often accept the numbers as stable markers. The numbers are stable within the texts that carry them. Their relationship to actual duration, to seasonal rhythm, and to parallel systems is more complex. Counting was a tool, not a mirror of time itself. This counted time shapes the perception of gaps. Where regnal lists break, time appears to pause. Where calendars are not preserved, periods become harder to place. The absence of a count can feel like an absence of history. In reality, it marks a boundary in record-keeping rather than in human activity. Maps that shrink and stretch the past. Maps do not record time directly, yet they shape how time is understood. By arranging places in relation to one another, they suggest continuity, distance, and connection. When maps change, the perceived structure of the past changes with them. What appears close can seem recent. What appears distant can seem ancient. The result is a quiet distortion that affects historical imagination without announcing itself. The earliest known maps were not intended to be comprehensive. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets dating to the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia BCE depict small areas of land, canals, and city boundaries. One well-known example, often called the Babylonian map of the world, dates to around the 6th century BCE. It shows a central landmass surrounded by water, with Babylon marked near the center. The map includes labels for regions and distant lands, some real and some symbolic. It is not scaled in a modern sense. Its purpose is conceptual rather than geographic. Such maps compress large areas into simple forms. Rivers become lines, cities become points. The arrangement reflects political and cultural priorities. Babylon occupies the center, not because of measured distance, but because of perceived importance. Time is implied through tradition and authority rather than through sequence. The map presents a world that feels complete and ordered, even though it omits vast regions and long histories. In ancient Egypt, maps were often practical documents tied to administration. Tomb paintings and papyri show irrigation layouts, field boundaries, and work plans. The Turin papyrus map, dating to the reign of Ramesses IV in the 12th century BCE, depicts a mining region in the eastern desert. It shows wadis, roads, and mineral deposits, annotated with notes about stone quality. The map serves a specific task. It does not situate the area within a larger world, nor does it indicate how long the routes had been used. Greek mapmaking introduced new ways of relating space and time. Thinkers such as Anaximander and Hecataeus attempted to describe the known world as a continuous surface. Later, Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth using shadow measurements and distance estimates. These efforts aimed at proportional representation. Even so, surviving descriptions suggest uneven accuracy. Some regions were well described due to travel and trade. Others were filled in with hearsay or left blank. The work of Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE had lasting influence. His geography compiled coordinates for thousands of locations, drawing on earlier sources. The text was copied and recopied and later translated into Arabic and Latin. Medieval and early modern maps based on Ptolemy show a structured grid of latitude and longitude. However, the data within that grid varied in reliability. Distances in some regions were exaggerated, while others were compressed. These distortions affect how historical periods are perceived. When a region is shown as distant or marginal, its past can seem detached from the main narrative. When a region is placed close to a cultural center, its history appears more immediately connected. The map becomes a silent editor, shaping which timelines feel central and which feel peripheral. Medieval world maps, often called mappamundi, illustrate another approach. These maps, produced in Europe between the 8th and 15th centuries, combine geography with theology and history. Jerusalem is often placed at the center. East is positioned at the top, reflecting religious symbolism. Biblical events are integrated into the landscape. The Garden of Eden appears alongside known cities. Time collapses into space. Past, present, and sacred history coexist on a single surface. In these maps, chronology is not linear. Events from different eras occupy neighboring positions. The viewer is not meant to trace development over time, but to contemplate order and meaning. From a modern perspective, this can make large spans of history seem simultaneous. The deep past and the recent past share the same frame, without markers of separation. Islamic cartography developed along different lines. Scholars such as al-Idrisi, working in the 12th century at the court of Roger II of Sicily, compiled geographical knowledge from travelers and earlier texts. Al-Idrisi's world map, oriented with south at the top, presents continents and seas with relative clarity. Yet even here, scale varies. Regions with dense information appear detailed, while others are generalized. The map reflects the reach of travel and communication at the time of its creation. As maps were copied and adapted, they accumulated layers of assumption. A coastline drawn once could persist for centuries, even if it was based on limited observation. Inland regions might be filled with names but little spatial accuracy. When later historians consult such maps, they encounter a picture that blends observation from different periods. Time becomes layered within the image. Early modern exploration expanded geographic knowledge but introduced new compressions. As European navigators charted coasts in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, maps were updated to include these outlines. Inland areas often remained blank or speculative. On these maps, newly contacted regions appear suddenly, as if entering history at the moment of mapping. Indigenous histories that stretch back millennia are not visible. The map marks a beginning that reflects documentation rather than occupation. This effect is subtle but persistent. When a region appears on a map only after a certain date, it can be perceived as historically new. Earlier time is not represented spatially, so it becomes harder to imagine. The absence is visual rather than textual. It shapes understanding without explicit statement. Borders also influence temporal perception. Political boundaries drawn on maps imply stability. When a map shows an empire at its greatest extent, the image can stand in for the entire duration of that empire. Periods of contraction or fragmentation are harder to visualize unless multiple maps are compared. A single image can flatten centuries of change into one moment. Archaeological maps introduce another layer. Distribution maps showing sites from a particular period use symbols to mark presence. The density of symbols can suggest intensity of occupation. Yet these maps depend on discovery and publication. Areas with more research appear fuller. Areas with less research appear empty. Time seems to cluster where dots are dense, even if activity was widespread. The use of period labels on maps further compresses time. A map titled Neolithic Europe or Bronze Age Near East covers spans of centuries or millennia. Within that frame, variation is minimized. The viewer sees a single pattern where many phases existed. The map becomes a summary rather than a sequence. Modern digital mapping tools allow layers to be toggled, showing change over time. Even so, the habit of viewing space as static persists. A single screenshot can replace a dynamic process. The ease of representation encourages simplification. Maps shrink and stretch the past by deciding what fits on the surface. They privilege certain routes, centers, and regions. They omit others. They blend data from different times into a coherent image. This coherence is useful, but it carries a cost. It can make long developments appear brief and distant periods appear adjacent. The distortion is not intentional. It arises from the need to represent complex information in limited space. The past resists this compression, but the map enforces it quietly. What remains outside the frame, or beneath the symbols, is harder to perceive. Understanding historical gaps requires attention to these visual habits. When time seems to jump or compress, the cause may lie in representation rather than in reality. Maps offer orientation, but they also impose structure. They guide the eye and, in doing so, guide interpretation. Layers of silence between catastrophe and continuity. Archaeological visibility often increases at moments of disruption. Fire hardens clay tablets. Collapse leaves walls where they fell. Sudden abandonment freezes objects in place. These conditions create dense records that stand out against longer stretches of quieter use. Between such moments, continuity can pass with little physical trace, forming intervals that appear silent by comparison. One frequently cited example comes from the end of the Late Bronze Age in the Eastern Mediterranean, around the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Many sites show evidence of destruction by fire, abrupt abandonment, or major restructuring. At places such as Ugarit on the Syrian coast, written archives were preserved because the buildings burned. Letters, administrative records, and literary texts survived in large numbers. The moment of destruction produced clarity, while earlier and later phases are less densely documented. In contrast, periods of stability often generate fewer preserved records. When buildings are maintained rather than destroyed, floors are cleaned and reused. Broken objects are removed. Organic materials decay. The absence of catastrophe means fewer sealed deposits. Over time, this routine maintenance reduces the archaeological signal. Long occupation can leave a thinner trace than a single violent event. Environmental stress can create similar patterns. Droughts, floods, volcanic eruptions, and earthquakes can force rapid change. The eruption of Thera, dated to the mid-2nd millennium BCE, deposited ash across parts of the Aegean. At Akrotiri on Santorini, buildings were buried and preserved beneath volcanic material. Wall paintings, furniture, and vessels remained in situ. The preservation is exceptional, but it reflects a brief moment. Earlier phases of occupation beneath the ash are harder to access and less completely known. Earthquakes also leave distinctive signatures. Collapsed walls, tilted floors, and crushed objects can be identified in the stratigraphic record. In regions such as the Levant, sequences of destruction layers have been associated with seismic activity. These layers are often easier to correlate across sites than periods of gradual change. As a result, catastrophe becomes a chronological marker, while continuity remains diffuse. Recovery phases following disruption can be unevenly recorded. After a destruction, a site may be reoccupied quickly or after a long interval. The rebuilding may reuse earlier foundations, altering layouts while maintaining location. In some cases, new materials or construction techniques appear. These changes are visible. What is less visible is the social process of recovery, adaptation, and negotiation that unfolds over generations. The transition between the Roman and early medieval periods in parts of Europe illustrates this contrast. In some cities, monumental buildings fell into disuse or were dismantled. Stone was reused in smaller structures. Urban populations shifted. Archaeologically, this period was once described as a decline because fewer large buildings were constructed. Later research showed continued occupation with different forms of land use and material culture. The silence was partly a result of expectations shaped by earlier monumental phases. At Pompeii and Herculaneum, preservation is again linked to catastrophe. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE sealed buildings, streets, and objects under ash and debris. Daily life was captured in detail. In contrast, other Roman towns that evolved without such an event left more fragmentary records. Pompeii appears unusually vivid, not because it was typical, but because it was abruptly interrupted. Catastrophe can also distort regional narratives. If one site preserves a dramatic moment, while neighbouring sites do not, that moment can take on disproportionate importance. The destruction becomes a reference point for broader interpretations. Continuity elsewhere may be underrepresented because it lacks a comparable layer. Abandonment is not always total. Sites can be partially deserted, with populations moving within a region rather than leaving it entirely. Such thinning can be interpreted as decline or hiatus, even when activity continued at a lower density or in different forms. The ground records intensity unevenly. Environmental change can produce gradual shifts that are harder to see. A slow change in rainfall patterns may alter agriculture over centuries. Fields may be relocated. Settlements may move slightly to follow water sources. These adjustments leave subtle traces. Without a sharp boundary, the change blends into the background of the record. In some cases, catastrophe itself removes earlier evidence. Floods can scour deposits, landslides can carry material away, coastal storms can erode sites. The event that draws attention can also erase what came before. The preserved layer marks an end, not a beginning. Earlier continuity is lost beneath the disruption. The written record shows a similar imbalance. Chronicles often note disasters because they disrupt order. Floods, famines, and invasions appear in texts as notable events. Periods of stability receive fewer mentions. An annal might record a bad year and then pass quickly over several uneventful ones. The emphasis reflects what was considered noteworthy, not what was most common. This selective recording shapes later interpretation. When historians align textual references with archaeological layers, they may find strong correlations at moments of crisis. These correlations reinforce the visibility of catastrophe. The quieter intervals between them remain harder to define. The concept of a dark age often arises from this imbalance. A period with fewer monumental buildings, fewer inscriptions, and thinner archaeological layers can appear as a gap. The label reflects the state of the evidence, rather than a complete absence of activity. In many cases, later research has shown continuity through smaller-scale practices that were initially overlooked. Material culture itself changes in response to disruption. After a catastrophe, people may adopt simpler building techniques or different materials. These choices can reflect practical constraints rather than cultural loss. Over time, such practices become normalized. The archaeological record shows change, but not necessarily decline. Recovery can also involve deliberate forgetting. New regimes may dismantle symbols of earlier authority. Names may be erased from inscriptions. Buildings may be repurposed without preserving their original function. These actions create silences that are political rather than accidental. The absence of certain names or structures reflects choice. In some regions, repeated cycles of destruction and rebuilding create layered patterns of visibility. Each cycle produces a clear marker. The intervals between markers remain less distinct. Over long spans, history appears punctuated by events rather than sustained by continuity. Modern excavation strategies can amplify this effect. Archaeologists often focus on destruction layers because they are easier to interpret and richer in finds. Routine occupation layers require more effort to analyze and yield fewer dramatic results. Research priorities can therefore mirror the biases of preservation. The silence between catastrophe and continuity is not empty. It is filled with maintenance, adaptation, and daily practice. These activities leave fewer traces, but they constitute most of human time. The record does not proportionally represent this balance. Understanding historical gaps requires attention to what creates density and what creates thinness. Catastrophe concentrates evidence. Continuity disperses it. The contrast shapes perception. It can make the past appear episodic, even when life was steady. The layers of silence are part of the structure of the record. They are not failures of preservation alone, but outcomes of how societies functioned and how material survives. Recognizing this pattern allows the unevenness itself to be treated as data, rather than as absence. Chronologies built from fragments and assumptions. Modern historical timelines are assembled rather than discovered. They are constructed from surviving materials that differ in form, precision, and survival rate. Archaeological layers, written records, scientific dates, and later summaries are brought together to produce sequences that appear continuous on the page. The continuity is an outcome of method. The fragments themselves remain uneven. The process begins with relative ordering. In archaeology, stratigraphy establishes which layers lie above or below others. An object found beneath another is usually older in depositional terms. This principle is reliable within a single site, but it does not provide calendar dates. To move beyond local sequences, material from different sites must be compared. Pottery styles, tool types, and architectural features are used as markers. Similar objects found in different places are assumed to belong to overlapping periods. This comparative method works best when styles change gradually and are widely distributed. It becomes less secure when styles persist for long periods or vary regionally. A ceramic form used for centuries can link distant layers without narrowing time. Conversely, a local style might appear briefly in one region and never spread. When such material is used to synchronize sites, the resulting alignment reflects probability rather than certainty. Scientific dating methods add numerical ranges to this framework. Radiocarbon dating provides calibrated ranges rather than single years. Thermoluminescence and optically stimulated luminescence date the last exposure of materials to heat or light, again within margins of error. Dendrochronology offers greater precision where long tree ring sequences exist, but its applicability is limited by species and preservation. Each method contributes data that must be reconciled with others. Reconciling these data requires choice. When two dates overlap partially, they can be treated as compatible. Decisions are often justified through technical reasoning, but they also involve judgment. A sample may be excluded due to suspected contamination. A context may be reinterpreted. Over time, certain dates become standard reference points, while others fall out of use. Written sources introduce another layer of complexity. Texts provide named events, rulers, and sequences, but they are rarely dated in absolute terms. A chronicle might state that an event occurred in the 5th year of a king's reign. To convert this into a calendar year, the reign itself must be dated. That dating may depend on other texts, inscriptions, or synchronisms with external events. Synchronisms are moments where two independent records intersect. A treaty between rulers of different regions, a mention of a foreign king, or a shared astronomical event can link chronologies. These links are valuable, but they are limited in number. Large segments are dated relative to a few anchors, stretching precision thin as distance from the anchor increases. Later compilations often serve as scaffolding. King lists, dynastic histories, and chronographic works produced centuries after the events they describe provide structured sequences. These works sometimes combine archival material with tradition. Their internal consistency can give an impression of stability. At the same time, they may smooth over conflicts, overlaps, or uncertainties present in earlier records. An example can be seen in the reconstruction of early Egyptian chronology. The order of dynasties is known largely through later king lists, such as those attributed to Manetho, preserved indirectly through later authors. Archaeological evidence supports many of these sequences, but the lengths of reigns and exact dates remain debated. Different scholarly chronologies vary by decades or more, even when they refer to the same rulers. Mesopotamian chronology presents similar issues. The so-called long, middle, and short chronologies for the 2nd millennium BCE differ by several decades. These differences arise from how scholars interpret synchronisms, astronomical data, and textual references. Each system is internally coherent. None can be confirmed beyond doubt. The choice of chronology affects how events are aligned across regions. Once a chronological framework is established, it tends to be reused. Textbooks, museum labels, and reference works adopt a standard set of dates. These dates acquire authority through repetition. Revisions are possible, but they require broad consensus and careful justification. As a result, earlier assumptions can persist even as new data emerge. The visual presentation of timelines reinforces this stability. Charts and tables show periods arranged neatly along a line. Gaps are often minimized or bridged with dashed lines. Overlaps are simplified. The format suggests continuity even where evidence is thin. Readers encounter a smooth sequence rather than a field of probabilities. Assumptions also enter through periodization. Labels such as Neolithic, Bronze Age, or Iron Age group diverse societies under shared technological criteria. These categories are useful for comparison, but they are uneven in time and space. The transition into a Bronze Age occurs earlier in some regions and later in others. When timelines apply these labels uniformly, local variation is reduced. Cultural phases defined by material traits can also be extended beyond their secure evidence. A style known from a limited number of sites may be projected across a wide area. Absence of evidence in other regions may be treated as lack of discovery rather than lack of presence. Historical gaps are sometimes bridged through inference. If a settlement is occupied in one period and again in a later one, continuity may be assumed unless evidence of abandonment is clear. This assumption is practical, but it remains an assumption. Short interruptions, shifts in population, or changes in function can go undetected. The timeline favors persistence. The language used in chronological reconstruction often reflects this tendency. Terms such as emerges, develops, and transitions imply gradual change. They smooth over uncertainty. In many cases, the available data cannot distinguish between gradual and episodic processes. The wording reflects convention rather than resolution. Chronologies also absorb modern expectations. The desire for complete narratives encourages connection. Empty spans are uncomfortable. They invite explanation. When explanation is not possible, alignment offers an alternative. By fitting fragments into an ordered sequence, the sense of loss is reduced. The past appears more coherent than the evidence alone would suggest. This does not mean that chronologies are arbitrary. They are constrained by data and refined through debate. Over time, frameworks improve. New excavations, improved dating techniques, and reassessment of texts lead to adjustment. The process is cumulative. Still, the final product remains a model rather than a mirror. The deeper the past, the more weight is carried by fewer anchors. Small changes in interpretation can have wide effects. A single revised date can shift entire sequences. The structure remains, but its calibration changes. The apparent solidity of the timeline conceals this sensitivity. Chronologies built from fragments serve an essential function. They allow comparison, discussion, and analysis. Without them, history would dissolve into isolated cases. Their limits become visible when they are treated as complete rather than provisional. The gaps within these chronologies are not always highlighted. They are often implied through ranges, qualifiers, or footnotes. Outside specialist literature, these qualifications recede. The simplified version circulates more widely. Over time, it can replace the more cautious one in public understanding. Recognizing how chronologies are assembled does not undermine their use. It clarifies their nature. They are structures erected over uneven ground. Some sections rest on firm foundations. Others span open space. The joins are not always visible, but they shape the whole. What survives when memory is selective? Human memory does not function as an archive. It operates through repetition, relevance, and social reinforcement. What is remembered is what continues to be told, reenacted, or embedded in practice. What is not repeated fades, regardless of how significant it may once have been. Historical memory, even when written, follows this pattern. It preserves selectively, guided by use rather than completeness. In societies without widespread literacy, memory is carried through oral transmission. Stories, genealogies, and ritual knowledge are passed from one generation to the next through performance and instruction. This process favors clarity and structure. Complex sequences are simplified. Events are shaped into recognizable forms. Over time, details that do not support the structure are dropped. The memory remains active, but it changes. Even in literate societies, selective memory persists. Texts are copied because they are valued. A work that is not recopied does not survive long, especially when written on perishable materials. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets endured because they were baked accidentally or deliberately. Papyrus and parchment required ongoing reproduction. Libraries preserved what they considered useful, authoritative, or exemplary. This pattern can be seen in the transmission of epic literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh exists in multiple versions, copied over more than a millennium. Certain episodes recur consistently, while others appear only in fragmentary form. The survival of the epic reflects its cultural role rather than the completeness of its original composition. What remains is what was retold. Genealogies provide another example. Many early societies recorded lineages to establish inheritance, authority, or ritual obligation. These genealogies often extend backward to a founding figure. Intermediate generations may be compressed or omitted. The emphasis lies on connection rather than documentation. A lineage can bridge centuries with a few names, creating continuity while obscuring scale. In ancient Israelite texts, genealogies link tribal ancestors to later figures, establishing identity across long spans. The lists are structured and purposeful. They do not aim to record every generation. Gaps are not errors within that framework. They are a consequence of selective remembrance. Royal memory is similarly shaped. Inscriptions and monuments emphasize victories, building projects, and divine favor. Defeats, internal conflict, and administrative failures are less frequently recorded. When they appear, they may be reframed. The official memory of a reign is curated. Later historians relying on such sources inherit this curation. The practice of damnatio memoriae in the Roman world illustrates intentional erasure. Names were removed from inscriptions. Statues were defaced or dismantled. The goal was not to forget entirely, but to deny public remembrance. The individual's existence was not erased, but their sanctioned presence in memory was reduced. Archaeological traces sometimes preserve what texts sought to remove. Selective memory also operates through ritual. Annual festivals commemorate specific events. Over time, the ritual can persist even as its original context fades. The act of remembrance remains, but its reference shifts. In some cases, a festival may outlast the historical event it once marked, becoming detached from its origin. Calendrical rituals in agricultural societies often illustrate this process. A harvest festival may commemorate a mythic origin or divine intervention. The ritual continues because it structures communal time, not because its narrative details are constantly re-examined. Memory is maintained through action rather than analysis. Material culture participates in selective memory as well. Monuments anchor certain narratives in space. A standing stone, a temple, or a tomb marks a place as significant. The meaning attached to it can change over time, but its presence directs attention. Areas without monuments may have been equally important, but they leave fewer cues for remembrance. The reuse of ancient sites demonstrates this continuity. Later societies often build on or near earlier monuments. The choice may be practical, symbolic, or habitual. The site's history is absorbed into new meanings. Memory is layered rather than preserved intact. Earlier phases influence later ones without being fully understood. Historical writing codifies selective memory. Chroniclers choose starting points. They decide which events deserve mention. Silence can reflect ignorance, but it can also reflect judgment. An uneventful reign may receive little attention. A dramatic episode may dominate the narrative, the proportion of text does not correspond to the proportion of time lived. In medieval chronicles, years may be marked only by brief notes until a crisis occurs. A famine, invasion, or death of a ruler receives extended description. The preceding decades may pass with little comment. The memory preserved is uneven. Stability leaves a lighter trace than disruption. The same pattern appears in later historiography. National histories often emphasize moments of founding, conquest, or reform. Long periods of continuity receive less focus. The narrative moves from event to event. The spaces between them are compressed. Memory aligns with narrative structure. Oral traditions can preserve information over long periods, but they do so by adaptation. Anthropological studies of oral histories show that core elements persist while peripheral details change. The structure of a story is maintained because it supports identity. Specific dates and sequences are less stable. Memory functions relationally rather than chronologically. This does not mean that oral memory is unreliable. In a simple sense, it is reliable for what it is designed to do. It maintains social knowledge, values, and relationships. It is less suited to preserving precise timelines. When later written records draw on oral tradition, they inherit its structure and limits. Selective memory also affects what is forgotten. Entire categories of activity may leave little trace because they were not considered worthy of record. Domestic labor, informal exchange, and child-rearing rarely appear in early texts. These activities sustained societies, but they were not codified. Their absence from memory reflects priorities rather than insignificance. The preservation of memory is influenced by power. Groups with access to writing, monument building, and institutional continuity leave more traces. Marginal groups leave fewer. Over time, the imbalance accumulates. History appears populated by elites because they controlled the means of remembrance. Archaeology can counterbalance this bias to some extent. Material remains reveal patterns of daily life that texts omit. Yet archaeology also faces selective preservation. Organic materials decay. Temporary structures disappear. What survives is filtered by environment and chance. The correction is partial. Cultural memory also operates through forgetting that is not deliberate. When practices change, old knowledge can lose relevance. Skills tied to obsolete technologies may disappear within a few generations. Terminology shifts. Meanings are lost. The past becomes foreign even to its descendants. Language change illustrates this process. Words fall out of use. Scripts are replaced. Without continuous literacy, earlier texts become unreadable. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform literacy declined and eventually ceased. Later cultures inhabited the same land without access to its written past. Memory ended not through destruction, but through discontinuity of skill. Religious transformation can have similar effects. When belief systems change, earlier sacred texts and rituals may be abandoned or reinterpreted. Some are preserved as antiquities, others are lost. The shift reorganizes memory around new frameworks. Selective memory does not produce a random past. It produces a structured one, shaped by repetition, authority, and survival. What remains feels coherent because it has been reinforced. What is missing often lacks a clear outline because it was not reinforced in the same way. When historians encounter gaps, they are encountering the limits of memory as much as the limits of evidence. The past was lived fully, but it was not remembered fully. The record reflects this imbalance. It carries forward what mattered to those who transmitted it. Understanding selective memory helps explain why certain periods appear thin. It clarifies why some figures are well known while others are invisible. The gaps are not always the result of loss alone. They are the outcome of choice, habit, and transmission over time. The long view from beneath the ice and sand. Not all records of the past are made by people. Long before writing, building, or formal memory, natural systems were already accumulating traces of time. Ice, sediment, pollen, and rock layers preserve sequences that are indifferent to human priorities. These records do not name individuals or events. They register conditions. Their value lies in their continuity rather than in their detail. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica provide one of the clearest examples. Each year, snowfall adds a thin layer of ice. Over time, these layers compress, trapping air bubbles and particles. Scientists can measure the chemical composition of each layer, revealing past temperatures, atmospheric gases, and volcanic activity. The sequence can extend back hundreds of thousands of years. Unlike human records, it does not skip years because nothing notable happened. Volcanic eruptions leave ash layers that can be traced across wide regions. These layers appear as thin, dark bands within ice cores and sediment deposits. When an eruption is independently dated, the ash layer becomes a marker that can be aligned with archaeological and historical records. The alignment is useful, but it is limited. The ash marks a moment, not a narrative. It provides a fixed point without context. Sediment cores from lakes and oceans offer similar continuity. As material settles year after year, it forms layered deposits. Changes in grain size, composition, and biological content reflect shifts in climate and environment. Pollen grains preserved in these layers show which plants were present at different times. From this, researchers can infer temperature, rainfall, and land use. The record is steady, but interpretation requires correlation. In arid regions, wind-blown sand accumulates in dunes and basins. These deposits can be dated using luminescence techniques that measure when grains were last exposed to light. The resulting timelines show periods of dune formation and stabilization. Such patterns reflect long-term climate shifts rather than human decisions. Yet, they frame the environments in which people lived. Natural archives often extend beyond the reach of written history. They show repeated cycles of warming and cooling, wet and dry phases, and ecological change. When these patterns are compared with archaeological sequences, mismatches appear. A cultural change may not align neatly with an environmental shift. In other cases, correspondence is clear. Neither outcome implies causation by itself. One challenge lies in scale. Environmental records operate at regional or global levels. Human records are local and selective. An ice core reflects conditions across a continent. An archaeological site reflects activity in a specific place. Connecting the two requires assumptions about how broad conditions affected local behavior. These assumptions are cautious but unavoidable. Another issue is resolution. Some natural records preserve annual or even seasonal detail. Others average change over centuries. Archaeological layers vary similarly. A site might compress long occupation into a thin deposit. When records of different resolution are compared, alignment becomes approximate. Precision in one domain does not guarantee precision in another. Despite these limits, environmental archives provide a counterpoint to human memory. They show that time continued steadily through periods that appear archaeologically thin. When settlement evidence fades, climate records often remain continuous. The absence of artifacts does not correspond to an absence of years. This perspective reframes gaps as differences in recording rather than breaks in existence. Ice cores also preserve signals of human activity indirectly. Increases in atmospheric lead correspond to periods of intensified metal production. Changes in greenhouse gases reflect agricultural expansion and deforestation. These signals appear without names or dates, but they indicate collective impact. Human presence becomes visible as a trace rather than a story. Sediment records near ancient cities sometimes show shifts linked to land use. Increased erosion can reflect deforestation or intensive farming. Pollen records can show the spread of domesticated plants. These changes unfold gradually. They do not announce themselves as events. Their timelines rarely match political chronologies. Natural records do not privilege catastrophe over continuity. A flood deposit may appear as one layer among many. A drought registers as a shift in isotopic ratios rather than a narrative of crisis. The record treats all years equally. This neutrality contrasts with human records, which emphasize disruption. When combined carefully, natural and human archives expand temporal perspective. They do not fill gaps in the conventional sense. Instead, they show that gaps belong to specific kinds of evidence. Time itself remains present. The long view from beneath the ice and sand is uninterrupted, even when human records fall silent. Objects that refuse to fit their age. Archaeological interpretation depends heavily on context. An object is understood through where it is found, what surrounds it, and how it relates to other material. When that context is clear, dating is usually straightforward. When it is unclear or disturbed, interpretation becomes more cautious. Some objects resist easy placement not because they are extraordinary, but because their association with time is uncertain. Many such cases begin with recovery conditions. Artifacts found outside controlled excavations lack stratigraphic context. Items collected from the surface, dredged from rivers, or recovered during construction work often arrive without precise information about their original position. Without that information, the object cannot be securely tied to a layer or period. Its age must be inferred from material, style, or manufacturing technique alone. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, many collections were assembled before modern archaeological standards were established. Objects entered museums with minimal documentation. Labels might note a general location but omit depth, association, or recovery method. When later scholars encounter these items, they face gaps in information that cannot be repaired. The object survives, its context does not. Material durability can also create confusion. Stone, metal, and fired ceramics survive far longer than wood, fibre, or leather. A durable object can remain in use or circulation long after it was made. When such an item is eventually deposited, it may appear in a layer much later than its manufacture date. Without evidence of reuse, it can seem out of place. Metal objects illustrate this problem clearly. Bronze tools or ornaments could be melted down and recast. Iron objects could be repaired repeatedly. A blade forged in one century might remain functional for several generations. When finally discarded, it enters the archaeological record at the end of its use life, not at its point of origin. The difference can span decades or more. Heirlooms present a similar challenge. Objects valued for symbolic, religious, or familial reasons may be preserved and passed down. In burial contexts, such items can appear alongside more recent material. The grave represents a single moment of deposition, but the contents reflect multiple periods. Without recognizing this, an object may seem anachronistic. Disturbance of layers further complicates matters. Ploughing, animal activity, erosion, and later construction can move objects vertically and horizontally. A deeper layer may intrude into a shallower one. A pit dug in one period can cut through earlier deposits, mixing material. When such disturbance is not clearly identified, associations can be misleading. Caves and rock shelters often show this mixing. Long-term use combined with limited space leads to repeated disturbance of earlier deposits. Objects from different periods can end up close together. Careful excavation can sometimes separate these episodes, but earlier work often did not. Legacy collections from such sites may therefore contain mixed material. Classification systems also play a role. Archaeological periods are defined by characteristic features. An object that does not match expected forms can be difficult to place. It may represent a local variation, a rare experiment, or a transitional type. Without comparative examples, it may appear anomalous. Over time, as more material is discovered, such objects often find a place within an expanded framework. One example comes from early metallurgy. The appearance of copper and bronze objects does not occur simultaneously across regions. Early metal use overlaps with stone tool traditions for long periods. In some areas, metal objects appear sporadically before becoming common. An isolated early metal artifact can seem out of sequence when compared to later standardized assemblages. Scientific dating can resolve some cases, but it has limits. Radiocarbon dating applies only to organic material. Dating associated material assumes that the association is secure. Direct dating of metal is difficult. As a result, some objects remain dated primarily by comparison. When comparisons are sparse, uncertainty remains. Occasionally, objects attract attention because they seem to challenge established timelines. In most cases, further analysis shows that the issue lies in context rather than chronology. A misidentified layer, a disturbed deposit, or an outdated typology can account for the discrepancy. The object itself has not moved through time. Its interpretation has. Museums often revisit such cases. Advances in analytical techniques allow for reassessment. Metallurgical analysis can identify production methods. Microscopic wear studies can indicate use life. Residue analysis can reveal contact with specific substances. These methods add information, without altering the object's physical form. In some instances, re-examination leads to reclassification. An object once thought unique may later be recognized as part of a known tradition. In others, uncertainty remains. The absence of decisive evidence keeps the object at the margins of interpretation. It is recorded with qualifiers and left open. Objects that resist placement are not evidence of missing errors on their own. They highlight the dependence of chronology on context and method. They show how much interpretation relies on association rather than on the object in isolation. Without context, time becomes harder to assign. The archaeological record contains many such items. Most are quiet anomalies rather than dramatic challenges. They sit in storage drawers and catalogue entries, noted and bracketed. Their presence reflects the uneven way material enters the record. These objects remind researchers that classification systems are tools, not containers. They are designed to organize known material, not to predict every variation. When an object does not fit neatly, the response is adjustment rather than revision of time itself. Gaps that appear only after translation. Not all historical gaps are created by loss of material. Some appear when surviving material becomes unreadable. Language change, script change, and shifts in interpretation can place existing records beyond immediate understanding. The text remains, but access to its meaning weakens. The gap forms not in the ground, but in comprehension. Writing systems are learned technologies. They require continuous transmission of skill. When that transmission breaks, texts can persist physically while becoming opaque. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform writing was used for more than 3,000 years. It evolved from pictographic signs into complex syllabic and logographic forms. When its use ended in the 1st century CE, the ability to read it disappeared. The tablets remained buried or reused as building material. For more than a millennium, their content was inaccessible. The rediscovery of cuneiform in the 19th century did not immediately restore continuity. Early travelers copied inscriptions without understanding them. Scholars debated whether the signs represented sounds, ideas, or numbers. Only after decades of comparative work, involving inscriptions from Persia and bilingual texts, did systematic decipherment become possible. During that interval, the historical record existed without meaning. A similar pattern occurred with Egyptian hieroglyphs. After their use ceased in late antiquity, the script became symbolic rather than linguistic in later imagination. Medieval writers speculated about hidden meanings. The ability to read the language was lost. Temples and tombs were visible, but their inscriptions were silent. The gap lasted until the decipherment work of Jean-François Champollion in the early 19th century, aided by the Rosetta Stone. Centuries of recorded history re-entered readable form only after translation restored access. Scripts can survive while languages change. In early medieval Europe, Latin writing persisted while spoken. Latin evolved into distinct Romance languages. Texts remained readable to trained clerics, but became less accessible to the general population. Knowledge narrowed to institutional contexts. What survived was filtered through education and authority. The gap was social as much as linguistic. In other cases, both script and language shift. The Linear B tablets of Mycenaean Greece provide an example. Written in a syllabic script and preserved by fire, the tablets were discovered in the early 20th century. For decades, their content was unknown. When the script was deciphered in the 1950s, it revealed an early form of Greek used primarily for administration. The tablets did not record myths or histories, but they demonstrated continuity between Bronze Age and later Greek language. Before decipherment, that continuity was not visible. Translation also introduces interpretive gaps. Understanding a text requires more than reading its words. Cultural context shapes meaning. Administrative terms, legal formulas, and ritual language can resist direct translation. A word may have no precise equivalent in another language. Translators must choose approximations. Over time, these choices influence interpretation. Chronicles translated long after their composition can reflect later assumptions. Terms may be rendered using concepts familiar to the translator rather than those of the original audience. Political titles, social categories, and geographic names can shift meaning. The translated text becomes a hybrid. It carries original information within a new framework. The preservation of meaning depends on reference systems. Lexical lists, commentaries, and parallel texts help anchor interpretation. When these supports are lost, translation becomes speculative. In Mesopotamia, bilingual Sumerian-Akkadian lexical lists preserved knowledge of an older language. When Sumerian ceased to be spoken, it remained in use as a scholarly and ritual language. The lists allowed later scribes to read and copy earlier texts. Without them, Sumerian literature might have become unreadable much earlier. In contrast, some writing systems left few interpretive aids. The script known as Linear A, used on Crete in the 2nd millennium BCE, remains undeciphered. Inscriptions survive on tablets and seals, but the language and sign values are not securely known. The existence of the record is clear, its content is not. A historical layer remains present, but silent. Gaps created by translation also occur when texts survive only in later copies. Copyists introduce errors, updates, and omissions. Marginal notes can enter the main text. Sections can be lost. When scholars reconstruct an earlier version, they work backward through layers of transmission. Religious texts illustrate this process. Many sacred writings were copied over centuries, translated into multiple languages, and interpreted through commentary traditions. Differences between versions reflect both transmission history and doctrinal choice. The gaps between versions are not always recoverable. They shape how the past is understood. Even when a language is known, shifts in scholarly interpretation can reopen gaps. New readings of familiar texts can change chronology, geography, or attribution. A place name may be re-identified, a title may be reinterpreted. What once seemed settled becomes provisional. The gap is not newly created, but newly recognized. Translation is therefore not a final act. It is an ongoing process that mediates access to the past. Each generation approaches texts with different tools and assumptions. Some meanings become clearer, others recede. The record remains incomplete not because it is absent, but because it requires continuous effort to remain legible. Gaps that appear after translation remind us that survival of material is not enough. Understanding depends on continuity of knowledge. When that continuity breaks, centuries can pass before it is restored. If it is restored at all, the past can exist in plain sight and still remain unreachable. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop your thoughts in the comments and share the video if you found it interesting.